As a year leader, what's a common mistake you find students make?
Okay, so thank you for giving me the opportunity for this interview. Yeah, so in terms of common mistakes that the students usually make, so as an academic, so I will break them down into three overarching themes. So the first being time, what I call it time mismanagement, and the poor study habits. And then the second is not maintaining good relationship and social life, and the third I call academic related mistakes. So I will go over them one at a time. So in terms of time mismanagement and poor study habits, so one of the things that we've seen students often do is procrastination. So they tend to leave put off assignments and they are studying until the last minute, right? So you've got an assessment due maybe next week, and that's when they remember they have to start reading, right? So I think one of the problem that causes students is that it impacts negatively on their grade. So if you haven't got enough time to plan or prepare for your assessment, that definitely is going to affect on your grade, right? So in terms of advice to students, so I always encourage my students, to have make good use of their time. So at the beginning of the semester, so have a clear plan of how your semester is going to progress. Make sure you've got an understanding of the deadlines, for each modules, and when you have to hand in your assessment. Yeah. So under time management and the poor academic skills, so one of other things that I also notice with the students is what you call a cramming, right? So when students are preparing for exams, so they tend to spend more time at last minute, studying, so try to cram all the materials in preparation for the exam. So one of the danger with that is that if you are using that strategy of learning, then it is very obvious that it's going to impact negatively in your grade. So cognitive psychologists talk about different stages of memory retention, right? So different ways we can retain a memory, right? So in terms of working memory, so they talk about rote rehearsal. So this is when information is being repeated verbatim. So information in working memory is stored acoustically in terms of how it sounds. Yeah. So if you involve in cramming, so reading every line of the text word for word, that is not really a good strategy, because what happens is when you get to the exam hall and there is a distraction, you forgot everything that you've crammed, right? That you've tried to remember. So what I've always advised a student is use what you call a elaborate rehearsal. So before you start reading the material, so try to ask yourself, so why do I have to know about this topic, right? If it's a theory of social learning, for instance, by Bandura, so why do I have to learn about this theory? Of what benefit, right? So think beyond the academic, right? To look at it in terms of the applied implication. How can this, theory help me in explaining phenomena, right, in the society? Yeah. So if you got that, idea in mind, it will help you when processing, any material that you've been given in the lecture. So you tend to process it in terms of meaning, semantically. And when information is processed semantically, it tends to stay in the long-term memory, right? So anytime somebody call you and ask you, Sophie or Matthew or whoever, explain this theory for me, right? So you are able to explain the theory because you got some good understanding of the theory, right? So the other common mistakes I also find students make is what I call studying as a single player game, right? So you often see some students, they prefer to study on their own, so they lock themselves up, in the room, right? Just like, someone, playing a game, right? Yeah. So why it works for some students, for others, it can be, very boring, right? And that tends to impact negatively So what I often say to students is that, we have to respect, different abilities that, you guys have, so none of us have a monopoly of knowledge, So when I was a student, one of the things that really helped us as students at the time is what I call a group learning, right? So I often encourage my students, to form small groups, right? So because we all have different abilities, and this explains why some students, graduate with a first class, some, 2-1, some 2-2, some third class, right? Because when the lecturer is there teaching in the classroom, right, not everybody will grab, all the information, right? So we all retain information differently. Yeah. So when you form a small group, and then there is a particular topic or maybe concept you're struggling to understand, so hearing that from your friend or your fellow classmate, right, him or her, explain it in their own words, will help you, understand it better compared to when you are studying alone, struggling and to understand this difficult concept. But when you have other students explain it, from their own, using their own words, I think, is one way that, students can improve their learning. So the other common mistake I also found the student making is failing to diversify, their learning. So by this I mean, relying on one single, resource for learning. Yeah. So think of, statistics, for instance. So we know statistics, have different, there are different textbooks that you find in the library. And some of these textbooks are written in a very, high technical language, right? So if for some students that have, statistics anxiety, so they really get, frustrated, reading this textbook over and over again, trying to understand, right, the materials. Yeah. So what I often, encourage students to do is don't rely on a single, resource, right? If there are 5 different textbooks discussing or explaining one particular theory or concept. So try and read all these 3, 4, or 5 different textbooks.
Yeah.
Because the authors of these books, so some of them use a simplified language. So for instance, statistics. So Andy Field, so he published this book, Understanding Statistics Using SPSS. So I love this book, and it's one of the books I recommend to undergraduate students because it is, he used a very, simplified language and used some, humor, right? So compared to some, textbooks that are, written in a high technical, language that some students, might find it very difficult to grasp. So my advice, for students is try to diversify, their learning and not rely on one single, resource. So the other common mistake I also found the students making is skipping classes. So skipping classes. Yeah. So I know, academic life is can be busy. So students often, some students, not everyone, find it difficult to, maintain a good, balance, between their academic and the social life, right? So some skip lectures, seminars, workshop, and they leave everything to last minute. But as academics, we know the impact this have in some of their grade, right? So again, this all link back to what I said earlier about time mismanagement. So having a good time management, so time you go for gym, time you go for clubbing, time you go for your seminars, but always prioritize your academic because that is what you are here for, right? So, and that leads me to the next, point, common mistake that I think, students often make, and that is not having a clear goal, right? A clear academic goal. Yeah. So one of the questions I often ask students, especially the freshers, the first year students, is, can you tell me why you want to study psychology, right? Why you want to study psychology.
Yeah.
And at times, you often hear some of them, waffle and, So the reality is this, my experience, working with students over the past years is that some of them, so maybe, I wouldn't use the word some, but at least there are a good number of students that oh, my mates are going to uni, so I have to go to uni, right? So not having a clear goal. So why am I studying psychology? Why am I studying law? Why am I studying, sociology? Why am I studying political science? Why am I studying medicine, right? So if you have a clear goal, it will define your motivation, right? Yeah. So if you haven't got a clear goal, then you don't really know whether this is the right path for you, right? So I often say to students, so make sure you have a clear goal.
Yeah.
So what do you expect to gain at the end of your degree, right? So what purpose, right, would this degree serve for my future career, right? So having that clear goal, I think, is very, very important. And then the other point, the other theme that I talked about is the relationship and the social life. So students often, get carried away by what I call social distractions. So they often get caught up with loads of, activities outside the uni. So they get engrossed with their social media. Spend, so much time on social media, going to parties, clubbing, etc. And we know that some of these have negative impact on academic performance, right? And this is also linked back to what I said earlier about having a clear goal, having a good planning, good time management, also having that good work-life balance. I think is very, very important. And my next point is not seeking support. I think this is one of the major mistakes students across the board, right, often make, right? So not seeking support. So by this I mean so not reaching out to friends, families or university resources, when they are struggling. Do you understand?
Yeah.
So this can often lead to isolation and burnout, right? So I often say to students, look, nobody has got monopoly of knowledge, right? For the fact that I come to the classroom, right, talking doesn't mean that I know everything, right? So it's a collaborative learning. So I learn from you guys, you also learn from me, right? So if there is anything you don't understand, ask questions, right? So don't struggle alone, right? Ask questions, because if you don't ask your lecturers, your personal tutors, if you don't engage them, if you don't ask them questions, there is no way they know that you are struggling, right? So we know that you have introverts and extroverts. Some people like to keep things to themselves, but what I do encourage the students is ask questions, make use of all the resources available on campus, right? So if you are struggling with your mental health, reach out to your personal tutors. If you are struggling, academically, or if there are some topics covered in the lecture that you didn't understand, reach out to the module coordinators, right? So whenever I hear students, complain, the first question I often ask them: Have you arranged a meeting with your module coordinator? Have you asked them questions, right? And they will go like, oh no, I don't know if they're going to attend to me. I say, but ask, right? Ask. Yeah. So I don't think there is any of my colleagues. I've never had any student send me email and I said, sorry, I cannot attend to you, right? I always give everybody attention. So asking questions, making use of all the available resources available, I think is very, very important. So the other common mistake is the one that I call the academic related mistakes, and that is down to things like feedback, right? So when students' work is being assessed, we often provide them with feedback, and we know that feedback is very, very crucial for performance improvement, right? So it allows the students to recognize their strengths and weaknesses. So one of the things, not just me as an academic, but some of my colleagues, at the school, I think we've all identified this as one of the common mistakes that students make, is not attending to the feedback, right? So whenever I release my, module, grades, I often encourage the students. So please spend time to review the feedback. And if there is anything that you don't understand, please reach out, right, to the model coordinator for clarification.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because if you haven't understood, right, the reason why you didn't get a higher grade, right, it's likely that you're going to repeat the same mistake, right? And that overall, that overall is not good, right? Because it will impact negatively in your final, degree. Yeah, so I do encourage a student, to always don't take, feedback for granted, right? So if you don't understand, if you need some clarity, please reach out to whoever, provided the feedback in the first place. Yeah, so it's very, very important. And the other, common mistakes that I also find the students make is, not, proofreading their work. Yeah, so again, this is all down to, procrastination that I talked about earlier, so leaving things to the last minute, right? So I often see students, make some, very silly mistakes, right? Something that could have been avoided if they had spent time to proofread their work, make sure it's all free from all typos or grammatical errors, etc. So I've assessed, I think, 1 or 2 set scripts, last year, whereby I found the students submitted a draft, right? So they have lots of comments, and this is meant to be the final assessment, right? Yeah. It has lots of, comments in it. The reference lists are not included, right? So there are lots, too many typos, lots of, track changes, left in the script, So again, this is all down to, procrastination, right? So leaving things to the last minute, not allowing enough time, right, to do the assessment, and then, make sure that you include everything that has been asked for. Yeah, so I think, these are, some of the common mistakes. Like I said, it's not, it's not, so this is not an exhaustive list, right? Yeah. But, from my experience as an academic, so these are some of the major mistakes I found students making, almost, it's not just tied to me, year 1, year 2, or year 3, it's something that cut across board, right? So, but some students are really good, but there are still some students that often make these mistakes, So I think, the key message here is, as a student, have a clear goal, so have a good, make good use of your time, have a clear outline, right? So at the beginning of each semester, look at, the models that I'm taking this semester. Then, so when are the dates, the deadlines for handing in assessment, draft, etc. So make sure you have a clear goal. Make sure you use all the available resources on campus. Make sure you ask questions when you are unsure. Honestly, when I have my, RS4 groups, one of the questions I ask the students is, I'm going to present you with the tips, right, for succeeding in this model. And they were all looking at me and said, okay, what are the tips? I said, the first tip is ask questions. Tip number 2, ask questions. Tip number 3, ask questions, right? And they all start laughing, right? And I told them, yes, because that is the only way we know, right? Nobody has got monopoly of knowledge, right? And when I was a student, that is what really helped me. So I usually reach out to my seniors. So when I was in first year, some of my friends are in year 2, year 3, right? So because I know they have done this before me, right? So I often, ask questions, to those, my seniors. And, the group learning is very, very, very important, and that is one of the things that I always encourage students. Honestly, don't study alone. Try and form small groups, because we all have a different talents, different abilities, so, when you bring all that together, honestly, I mean, the impact is massive.